What's up everybody, Jeff here, and if you have been watching my channel for any amount of time, then you might know that I'm a big fan of a little game called The Other Side. The Other Side is kind of like a sister game to Malifaux. It's more of an army scale game, and it takes place in the same universe, but on the other side of the breach, which is Earth. And it's a really interesting game. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but I actually recently, along with a couple of my buddies, ran an event that was sponsored by Weird where we gave away some gift cards just for playing some games of The Other Side. But I thought I would take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the rules of The Other Side, because there's definitely a lot of people out there who have been curious or maybe even have some TOS stuff laying around but have never actually had a chance to jump in and try the game. The really interesting thing about the game system is that the mechanics have a lot in common with Malifaux. Of course, you use a fate deck, and there's a couple other things that cross over pretty directly. But there's also some details that are slightly different, and in a weird way that actually makes it kind of hard to remember those differences. It's almost like playing two different editions of the same game, where trying to remember which rules apply to which can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go through 5 of the key differences in the mechanics between Malifaux and The Other Side, and highlight some of the differences and why I think they're actually really interesting and maybe something we might eventually see come to Malifaux down the road. So let's get right into it. The first difference that I want to talk about is the way that cheating works in an opposed duel. A lot of the process for resolving an opposed duel in The Other Side is going to work very similarly or exactly the same to Malifaux, with some important differences. The main one being that the attacker in The Other Side always has the first opportunity to cheat. In Malifaux, of course, whoever is losing the duel has the first opportunity to cheat, and then the other player gets to cheat. But in TOS, it's always the attacker, and that actually changes a lot more than it might sound like at first blush. It really gives a significant advantage to the defender because you're always going to know what the attacker is doing, what their actual total is after they have all the different options to modify their duel before you have to make those decisions. Whether they come in and they're beating you, or they come in with a really low card and they have to cheat up to try to match you, you are always going to know what they're doing before you have to do the same. Now, if you're thinking about how that would work in a game of Malifaux, I think that's probably not a great mechanic for Malifaux because there are relatively few duels that actually take place on any given turn in a game of Malifaux. If you have 8 models and they can each generate 2 to 3 opposed duels in a turn, it really isn't a ton, whereas in The Other Side, a lot of times you're going to have a unit that is going to potentially get 3, maybe 4, maybe even more opportunities to initiate an opposed duel, and you're going to have a bigger army. So you end up flipping a lot more duels in a game of The Other Side, and you don't actually generate a full hand of cards at the beginning of the turn automatically. So there's going to be way more times where you don't have the option, or you're not going to want to cheat a card in a duel in The Other Side compared to something like Malifaux. And because of that, giving the defender a little bit of an advantage on being able to cheat second, I think actually balances the game in an interesting way, because you're not always going to have those cards to cheat to make sure you save your model. So at the very least, you're going to know when the right time is to really make sure that that nice high card in your hand is going to give you value instead of just throwing it away and having your opponent cheat above you. I'm sure you can see why that might be very hard to remember if you play both games, but again, I think it is actually interesting, and it does add something to The Other Side that I think is important and probably wouldn't work very well in Malifaux at all. The second big difference between the two game systems is the way that triggers work, and I think this is actually my favorite difference, and it's actually something that I was kind of hoping that we would see come to Malifaux 3rd Edition after I played a little bit of TOS when 2nd Edition was kind of coming to a close. Unfortunately, we didn't see it happen, and maybe it's for the better in the grand scheme of things, but maybe it's something we'll see come to the game in the future. So there's 2 main differences when it comes to the triggers. The first one is that in The Other Side, you can declare as many triggers as you have the resources to declare. What that means is that if you, for whatever reason, have multiple suits in your duel, then you can actually use multiple triggers, as opposed to in Malifaux where you have to just pick one specific trigger to declare. In addition to that, there are certain triggers that will actually be allowed to be declared multiple times, kind of like the way that something like Critical Strike works in Malifaux, but you're going to see a little bit more of that in TOS. The other big difference is that there's an entirely different kind of trigger called a margin trigger. Now, if you are a Mayfang 1 player, then this might sound a little bit familiar, but basically the way that it works is if your total ends up being more than your opponent's total by a certain amount, you can actually reduce the amount and get a trigger out of it. So for example, maybe you have a margin 3 trigger where you have to reduce your total by 3, and assuming that you're still winning the duel, you get the effect of an additional trigger. Now, when you combine all those things together, it means that you can declare margin triggers plus triggers on all the different suits, and it means that there will be certain duels where you're declaring 3, 4, potentially even 5 triggers at once. And this leads to really interesting dynamics where you have models that you're going to get a ton of value out of. They're going to do all kinds of weird and interesting things, and I think it adds to the power fantasy of the game a little bit, whereas in Malifaux, it's always going to be just one specific trigger. And again, I think it's something that maybe suits the different game systems better because of a lot of the different things around the edges. But it always feels really fun and exciting when you get to rattle off a whole list of triggers that you're going to use to abuse your opponent in a game of TOS. It's something that I really enjoy. I think it's very cool. And again, maybe it wouldn't work so well in Malifaux, but we'll see. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. The third big difference between TOS and Malifaux is the way that you actually hire your army/crew. Malifaux is kind of straightforward, at least as far as other war games are concerned, where you have a pool of resources, namely soulstones, and you get to spend those to hire your crew. Of course, your leader is free, and then they come with a totem, which is also free, and then you're going to hire the rest of your crew as well as upgrades and stuff like that. The one thing I think that sets it apart from a lot of other war games, and I think it's really good, is that whatever you don't spend ends up being your soulstone pool that you use as resource when you're playing the game. I think it's one of the really interesting things about list building in Malifaux. But TOS works entirely differently. Instead of having a soulstone pool to begin with, you're actually going to set the size of a game of TOS based on the number of commanders that you're going to have in the game. So a kind of standard level game of TOS is 2 commanders, but you can definitely play a 1 commander game if you want something a little bit faster. You can also play a 3 commander game. I've actually never done that, but I'd really like to because it sounds like it'd be kind of crazy and fun. And then the commanders are actually going to grant you a certain amount of script, which is the in-game money, it's guild money, that you can then use to hire the rest of your army. Now, most commanders are going to give you 25 script, although there are some exceptions that are a little bit lower, a little bit higher. And that's one of the ways that they sort of balance out the different power levels of the commanders. But because of that, the size of the game is actually determined by the number of commanders, and it's another interesting decision point where you have to decide if you want to take some of the slightly weaker commanders and have a bigger army, or if you want to take some of the more elite commanders and have fewer of the support models. Now, just like in Malifaux, there are upgrades that allow you to sort of spend those last couple of points that you may have, and there's also really cheap models that are like 2 script and 3 script that'll allow you to make sure that you've spent every dollar that you have available. But unlike Malifaux, there is nothing to do with the leftover script, so if you don't spend it all, it's just a waste, unfortunately. I think it's a really interesting system because it allows the game to scale really easily. You don't have to worry about setting a specific soulstone or script value. It's just, do you want to play 1 commander, 2 commanders, 3 commanders, and you just go from there. It also makes the factions feel a little bit more distinct because, for example, the Guild and the Court of Two, which is 2 of the smaller factions in the game, the commanders that come with them have much lower script counts that they bring to the table. So you're going to be playing with a slightly smaller army if you play those factions, but you're going to have some abilities that sort of make up for that. Mostly that Karai can summon pretty easily, and Sonya can blow entire armies off the board with a couple of really powerful abilities she has. She really belongs in jail. The fourth thing that I want to bring up as far as differences between the 2 games, and this is one that I think actually, if you're a new player to TOS who plays other war games, this one can be a little bit hard to remember. And that is the way that you actually activate units in the game. So in Malifaux, you're going to activate a particular model. They're going to have 2 actions available to them, plus a bonus action if they have one available, and that is their activation. In TOS, it works a little bit differently than that. When you decide that you're going to activate a model, you actually have to give them a specific order. Now, a game that I can think of that has a somewhat similar system to this would be Drop Fleet Commander, where you give the ships a specific order that's going to determine some of the abilities that they can do. You may not be familiar with that game. It's very different than Malifaux on the other side, but really cool game that you should check out if you are interested in spaceships. Now, orders are basically going to determine what your models can do on their particular activation. It's going to determine whether they can move and how far, and it's also going to determine the types of actions that they're allowed to take. And it's interesting because it makes the game feel a lot more like an army scale game because you're kind of determining what your models are going to do before they get into their activation. Whereas in Malifaux, you're going to just do an action and then you can kind of decide what you want to do with your second action based on what happens with the first action. In this, you kind of have to know about it ahead of time. So you have to decide what you want to do, give them that order, and then that's determining the rest of their activation effectively. To slightly oversimplify things just a little bit, there's 3 orders that you can give to a model. One is advance, and that basically allows you to move up to your speed and do an action of your choice per fire team. So if you have a squad that has 3 different fire teams, each fire team gets their own action, and they can do any action they want. It could be a melee, it could be a gun action, it can be a support action, whatever you want. The second kind of order is a rush order, and this is roughly equivalent to a charge. What it actually does, though, is it allows you to move up to twice your normal movement speed, which even on a larger board like what you play TOS on, it can be deceptively far. And then you can take only a melee attack. So this is good for closing the distance, but it means that you aren't going to be able to do things like shoot or other types of support actions. You have to just run in and start bopping stuff. Makes some sense. And the last kind of order is a focused effort. So this doesn't actually generate any movement at all. You're going to kind of stay in the same place unless you have an ability that allows you to move outside of the order. But the bonus there is that it actually generates a token for you, which is a resource. There's one that's more or less like a focus in Malifaux, kind of. And then there's another one that actually will allow you to heal yourself by kind of regenerating more bodies or fixing some of your assets. Again, kind of a little bit more in depth than we need to get here. But then after you receive that order, you can do an action of your choice, and there's no restrictions on that. So you have to stay still, but you get a little bit of a bonus, and you also get to take whatever action you want. Now, there's 2 slight caveats to the way that all of that works. One is that there are certain actions that you are allowed to do above and beyond whatever actions you get generated by your order, and typically these are going to come from assets. So, for example, you might have a Titan that has a bunch of machine gunners attached to it, and it can take shots with those machine gunners, irrespective of the type of order that it gets. And then on top of that, all of your commanders are going to get to do a free morale action on their turn in addition to whatever order they get. That's kind of like a bonus action in Malifaux, except that it only applies to the commanders. Now, the last difference I want to highlight here, and again, this is one that I think is very easy to forget if you play both games, is the way that the jokers work. So in Malifaux, there's a lot of restrictions around what happens if you flip a joker, whether it's flipping the black joker or if your opponent flips the red joker. It stops you from cheating, and it determines the types of cards that you can and can't pick if you have a positive twist or a negative twist, all that kind of stuff. In the other side, it's a little bit more straightforward, and it's actually a little bit less punishing than in Malifaux. So the first big difference is that if you flip a joker, you're not allowed to cheat. Now that goes for the black joker or the red joker, although there's probably no reason why you'd want to cheat the red joker. But if for some reason you had flipped 2 cards, you can actually choose the other card instead of the joker, and that applies to the black joker as well. So if you have a positive twist and you flip the black joker and another card, you can keep the other card. Or there's a resource in this game called tactics tokens that allow you to reflip a check after you've flipped the card. If you flip a black joker, you can actually spend a tactics token to reflip it. You're stuck with whatever you get, but at least it's not the black joker. In addition to that, you can spend other resources like inspired tokens, which just add to your duel total, and you can spend those even if you flip a black joker. So it's still a really bad result if you flip a black joker on the other side, but it's not nearly as punishing as it is in Malifaux, where you're just screwed. If you flip a black joker, you're stuck with 0 and no suit. The other big difference here is that the red joker is, of course, a 14, just like in Malifaux, but it's a 14 of every suit, not any suit. And if you remember back to the first thing on this list, then you'll remember that you can declare multiple triggers in this game, which means that when you flip the red joker, you have one of each suit that you can spend and whatever the margin difference is between you and your opponent that you can use to declare triggers. So that's how you can get up to 4 and 5 and potentially even 6 triggers. So the black joker is a little less punishing. The red joker is a little better depending on the circumstances. And overall, I just think it's simpler. There's less rules to have to worry about when it comes to the jokers, which I think is kind of cool. So those are 5 interesting differences between TOS and Malifaux, and of course there are dozens and dozens more little differences between the 2 games, as well as some very big differences between the 2 games. But those are some of the ones that I think can be a little confusing and also kind of interesting to note between the 2 systems. Overall, I think that I find that TOS is a game that is much more focused on resource management. You have a lot of resources available to you, and deciding when is the right time to spend them and when is the right time to save them for something else is a really, really important part of the game. I can elaborate on that more in another video in the future, but one way to really demonstrate that is the fact that you don't draw a full hand of cards at the beginning of every turn. You have to actually spend your tactics tokens, which is a very important resource in the game, to generate cards at the beginning of the turn. So deciding when you want to use those for cards and when you want to use those for scoring points and when you want to use those for reflips, super important, and it makes the game feel really interesting and dynamic. Even though it overall has a very similar tactical feel to Malifaux, and it still uses the card system, which is obviously far superior to any other randomization system in any other game, it feels like its own game because you definitely get the sense of the kind of army scale where things are a little bit less determined and the resource management and the sort of planning ahead is a lot more important. I think it's a really cool system, and if you have never played it before, I have a bunch of resources on the channel to help you get into it if you're interested in trying it out. I definitely think it's worth looking at, and there's going to be some cool stuff coming hopefully very soon as far as the 3 Kingdom releases, and they've been teasing the Sandmen, which is going to be kind of interesting. So definitely keep an eye on this space because I plan to do a bunch more with TOS in the future. But that's all I got for you for now, so I want to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Power Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Dev. Thanks for watching.